The morning was gloomy. A low sky loomed over the waking streets. The thick air, heavy with summer humidity, carried the scent of damp earth. Cross arrived at the hospital early to interrogate Frederick Larson. Settling onto a creaky stool in the stuffy hospital room, William pulled out his notepad. "Start from the beginning," Cross said, eyeing Larson's worn-out face. He looked exhausted, but there was gratitude in his eyes. Taking a deep breath, Larson began his story. "I met Edward Dorsey in college. He was always the life of the party, the mastermind behind all kinds of wild ideas. Everyone was drawn to him. After college, Edward got a job at the Department of Health and after a while pulled me in as well, into the Vital Records Bureau. We stayed in touch, played poker, got together for holidays even after Edward got married. It went on like that for a few years. But everything changed when my cousin Eleanor Chesser's father passed away recently. In 6 months, she was set to inherit a substantial sum. I wasn't entitled to anything under the will, even though I was a distant relative. It stung. At a party one night, I mentioned it to Edward. We laughed and imagined all the ways we could spend that kind of money. By that time, my poker debt to Dorsey had become pretty serious. I was struggling financially. A week later, Edward Dorsey showed up at my place and asked to see a photo of my cousin, Eleanor Chesser. After looking at the picture, he laid out his plan. According to him, I had to erase the records of his marriage from the system. Technically, it was doable since I was still working at the Vital Records Bureau. Then he would marry my cousin, and I'd get a generous cut of the inheritance, along with my gambling debts wiped clean. Later, Edward would divorce Eleanor and walk away with a share of the fortune. Everyone would be happy and rich. But we had to move fast. The wedding with Eleanor had to happen before she received the inheritance. She couldn't have any suspicion that he was marrying her for the money. I asked him what his wife Vivienne would think about all this. He just laughed and said the whole plan was actually Vivienne's idea. "But why not just get a divorce?" I asked. He told me that a sudden divorce followed by a quick new marriage might raise too many red flags. William frowned and got up from his chair, pacing the room. Outside the window, old cars stood gleaming with morning dew. "And you agreed?" he asked. "Yes," Larson whispered, staring at the floor. I knew it was a terrible thing to do, but the sense of injustice and my gambling debt outweighed everything else. I was already having trouble at work and felt like I was about to get fired. Besides, I had called Eleanor a few times, asking for money to pay off my debts, but she always refused. So I made up my mind. After all, no one was supposed to get hurt. Losing a portion of an inheritance wasn't exactly a tragedy. "And then what?" William asked, listening to Larson intently. "Then I erased all records of Edward and Vivienne's marriage. At an art exhibit, Dorsey accidentally met Eleanor, and they started a relationship. 4 months later, they got married, and everything was going according to plan. But after a while, Eleanor realized what kind of man Edward Dorsey really was. It became clear to her that he didn't love her. She filed for divorce. From that moment on, they stopped living together. The whole plan collapsed." Larson closed his eyes, as if trying to recall something important. Dorsey was furious. He showed up at my place, begging me to talk to Eleanor and convince her to change her mind about the divorce. But Eleanor refused to even meet with me. The court hearing for the divorce was scheduled for the 10th, 3 days ago. 2 days before the hearing, Edward went to see Eleanor herself, trying to convince her to drop the divorce. And the next day I found out that Eleanor Chesser was dead. Now that bastard is going to inherit everything. Cross sighed in frustration as he walked to the window. The view outside was bleak, but the air after the rain felt fresh. But I personally saw Edward Dorsey's divorce certificate at his house, William said, surprised. That was a fake. I made it myself at Edward's request, just in case. Eleanor and Edward weren't living together, but they were still legally married, Larson said, closing his eyes. How did I not check the authenticity of that certificate? Cross felt a pang of shame. That was an unforgivable mistake. Where has Edward Dorsey's wife been this whole time? Cross asked. Edward rented her a separate house somewhere nearby, and I think he changed her documents. I'm not sure. All I know is that they barely saw each other to avoid suspicion. Edward also forbade me from meeting with Vivienne or even mentioning her. Not that I wanted to. Vivienne was a real piece of work. Honestly, she was the one pulling Edward's strings, and I was even a little afraid of her, Larson said, licking his dry lips. Did she have a red Packard? Cross asked. I never saw it, but she did drive, Larson replied. What did you do when you found out Eleanor Chesser was dead? Cross frowned. I rushed straight to Edward's house, of course. I had a feeling this wasn't an accident. Murder was never part of the plan. Edward was disturbingly calm. He sat me down in a chair, poured me a whiskey, and said that everything was back on track. I asked him, did you kill her? Edward smiled and said, it looks like an accident. I left an empty wine bottle on the balcony and shattered a glass near the body, and you better shut up and stay home. Remember, you're in this just as deep as I am. If you even think about going to the police, you'll end up in prison yourself. Don't forget it was you who erased the records of my marriage to Vivienne. Frederick Larson struggled to turn onto his side. One of his ribs was broken. What happened next? I told him I was going to the police and turned to leave, but as I reached the door, Billy McCoy was standing there. I hadn't seen him in years, and he looked like hell. Grinning, Billy sucker punched me in the chin and I blacked out. When I came to, I realized I was tied up. Edward and Billy had taken me to an old mill and thrown me into a well. Edward came by twice, tossing down food and water. And then, well, you found me, Larson said, closing his eyes. How did your business card end up at Miss Chesser's house? Cross asked. I have no idea. I hadn't been to Eleanor's house in over a year. Dorsey probably planted it there. He was at my place all the time. Grabbing one wouldn't have been hard for him. And the gloves with traces of wine? Dorsey planted those too? William was already certain of it. I've told you everything. I don't know anything about any gloves. One last question. Who was in this photo? Cross asked, handing Larson a torn piece of the picture. It was taken right after we graduated college. In the photo, that's me, Billy McCoy, Edward Dorsey, and his future wife, Vivienne St. Clair. Or, as everyone called her, Medea, Larson said, handing the photograph back to Cross. Why Medea? Cross asked. Medea is the most ruthless heroine in ancient Greek mythology. She killed her own brother, her children, and even her husband to achieve her goals. She's the embodiment of female deceit. Vivienne had all of those traits. She was exceptionally talented and knew how to captivate people. If you only knew how many young men and even professors had their hearts broken by her in college. But to her, they were just stepping stones to success. In the end, she graduated with top honors. She could have built an incredible career, but instead she became the embodiment of pure evil. And what color was Vivienne's hair the last time you saw her? Cross asked. Her hair could have been any color. She was always changing her appearance, Larson replied. Though last time I saw her, she was wearing a red wig. Cross returned to the police station. For the rest of the day, he couldn't shake Larson's words about the embodiment of female cunning. Ancient Greek Medea.